Greetings of the day, dear students, and welcome back to your English class. In today's class, we are going to study the poem from our textbook, Unit 5, Section 3, The Listeners, written by Walter de la Mare. This poem, The Listeners, is written by Walter John de la Mare. He was an English poet, short story writer, and novelist. He is probably best remembered for his work for children and for his poem, The Listeners. Let us now understand the poem paragraph wise. Line 1 to 4, para 1. Is there anybody there? Said the traveller, knocking on the moonlit door, and his horse in the silence champed the grasses on the forest's ferny floor. The opening lines of poem The Listeners introduce the poem's main character, set the scene and pose the question that is central to the mystery of the story. The subject of the poem is called simply the traveler, which implies that his journeying is the most important thing to know about him. He has come on horseback from some unknown location into the scene of the poem. Dismounting from the horse, the rider wastes no time in knocking at the mysterious door. The horse, relieved of its burden, eats the grass to its heart's content. The forest floor, covered with plants, and the atmosphere of absolute stillness surrounds the area. The sounds that are heard are that of the horse chewing the grass. Lines 5 to 8, para 2. And a bird flew up out of the turret above the traveller's head, and he smote upon the door again a second time. Is there anybody there? He said. In para second, the poet says that as soon as the traveller knocks on the door, a bird flows out of the tower of the mansion. It seemed that the bird was awakened by the arrival of the traveller and the supernatural phenomena within the house. Baffled and perplexed by no response from the depth of the house, the traveller knocked the door for the second time. Lines 9 to 12, para 3. But no one descended to the traveller, no head from the leaf fringed sill leaned over and looked into his grey eyes, where he stood perplexed and still. In para 3, the poet says that despite the second attempt of knocking at the door, no one moved downwards from the mansion towards the traveller, nor did a keen welcoming voice call out from the border of the window laced with leaves. Neither did anybody bend out of the window to know who the caller might be at the unearthly hour. Lines 13 to 16, para 4. But only a host of phantom listeners that dwelt in the lone house then stood listening in the quiet of the moonlight to that voice from the world of men. In para 4, the poet says that inside the house there are no humans, only a group of ghostly beings. These listeners stand in the moonlight as they listen to the human voice coming from outside. These ghostly beings crowd around the staircase onto which moonlight streaks as the quiet atmosphere in the empty house is disturbed by the sound of the traveler's voice. Lines 17 to 20. Para 5. Stood thronging the faint moonbeams on the dark stair that goes down to the empty hall, hearkening in an air stirred and shaken by the lonely traveller's call. In para 5, the poet says that the only witness to this sight was his horse and the stream of moonlight that unoccupied halls and ascended those uncanny stairs. It is not that the traveler was not received by anyone, but it was so that they have become the inhabitants of the next world, The spirits within the house heard each word of the scholar and were disturbed in their stark silence as the words he spoke penetrated their soul. Lines 21 to 24, para 6. And he felt in his heart their strangeness, their stillness answering his cry, while his horse moved cropping the dark turf neath the starred and leafy sky. In para 6, the poet says, the absence of any kind of sound or movement sends a chill up his spine and he is troubled. While the meeting between the mortal, that is the traveler, and the immortals, the spirits in the house, was progressing. His horse continued eating grass under the shield of the stars and the trees, unmoved by the events of the night. Lines 25 to 28, para 7. For he suddenly smote on the door, even louder, and lifted his head. Tell them I came, and no one answered, that I kept my word, he said. In para 7, the poet says that the traveler suddenly beats on the door once again, even more loudly than before. It seems that he is desperate to get inside the house. But there is no response. He then calls out, asking whoever is listening to pass on a message. He says that no one answered him when he came to the house. No one came, but he kept his promise and came back to the house. Lines 29 to 32, para 8. Never the least stir made the listener, though every word he spake fell echoing through the shadowiness of the still house from the one man left awake. In para 8, the poet says that no matter how much the traveler cried for somebody to open the door or to respond, the listeners could do only one thing, and that is to quietly listen to the traveler's calls. But there was only one living soul who could feel the moment, and that was the traveler. He understood that whoever he was looking for, whoever he came back for, is no longer in this house. That person was no longer in the mortal world, and now that person had gone into the immortal world. That made the poet sad, but that was the reality, that the only living soul there was the traveler himself. Lines 33 to 36, para 9. Aye, they heard his foot upon the stirrup, and the sound of iron on stone, and how the silence surged softly backward when the plunging hoofs were gone. In para 9, the poet says that now the phantom listeners hear the traveler jump up onto his horse, and then they hear the sound of the horse shoes on the stone path as the traveler rides away. The silence of the forest quickly returns as the sound of the horse forceful riding fades away in the distance. In this poem, the poet Walter de la Mare wants to say that people cannot always find the answers they seek, regardless of how hard they look, like the traveler who's trying hard to connect back with someone but is unable to do so and is forced to leave the place again. So that'll be all for today's class. Until we meet again, stay safe, stay healthy, and keep learning.